the death of RT America. That is exactly what we are facing right now. The company RT has decided to shut down the America branch of its international operations. That would be the Russian-funded television news network. Now, obviously, since the entire war in Ukraine began, many countries have simply shut down RT and completely censored it. In the European Union, you can't even get it anymore. You can't even get their YouTube channel anymore. That's how high the censorship is. Well, now in the US, you can't even get RT America anymore. It's been shut down. Because with all the countries censoring RT, and particularly those of the English language, there's just not a point to be running it anymore. I mean, if you have something purely for information, but that information can no longer get out, what's the point of spending all the money on it? To which I question the motive behind privatizing RT to begin with. But that's another video for another day. Now, of course, we know RT is going to be Russian propaganda. Of course it is. Just as the media here is going to be NATO propaganda and conveniently overlook things like the Azov battalion, etc. But all of this is to be expected. Of course, the Russian media is going to play things from the Russian perspective, and of course, the media of the NATO countries is going to play things of the NATO perspective. So it's nothing to be unexpected here. I mean, I kind of thought that it was going along this direction already to begin with. But what is important in this case is the difficulty that we've been having in getting any reliable information about the ongoing conflict inside of Ukraine. Now, of course, the NATO-aligned media is giving wild exaggerations, to some of them to the point of nonsense. And I'm sure the Russian media, particularly RT, is not telling us everything either. It's war. And as they say, the first casualty in war is the truth. I've heard some nonsense claims that Russia has lost 10,000 soldiers already in the conflict. That's, if you know how many soldiers are actually involved and how many are standing in reserve, you'd know 10,000 is a pretty ridiculous number. Maybe 1.5, maybe 2,000. But even that, I think, is stretching it a little bit. The reason is because we don't have a reliable source of information. One of the things that I like to do is keep an eye on things like this. I speak to people that I know who have military knowledge, who know a lot about past conflicts. If you don't know, then you find somebody who does. And they're all telling me the same thing. We don't really know what's going on because we don't have any reliable information. And that leads me back to my point, the truth being the first casualty in war. So, I think one of the other problems is that we do have a right to see RT. We do have a right to see what Russia is saying, because we cannot expect the NATO-aligned media to tell the entire truth. I'm sure they'll give you some facts and figures that are correct, but they're always going to leave stuff out, like the Azov battalion. Or the fact that in 2016, the United States literally changed the law that said you couldn't give weapons to neo-Nazi forces, Nazi sympathizers, etc. And they literally got rid of that money so they could send things to Euromaidan and Azov, etc. in Ukraine. But we're not going to get the full truth from Russia either. Well, that's kind of the point, and this comes back to one of those old things about balance. That if you can at least see all sides of a conflict, then you can get a better understanding of what's going on. Keep in mind, as far as I know, no people in Russia are banned from seeing any kind of Western media. Now, I may be wrong about that. The last I checked, there is no Western media since the breakout of the war that has been banned in Russia. So I will at least give the Kremlin points for that, at least not doing that kind of censorship. And we should understand that this is censorship. Now, I'm not necessarily against censorship myself, because everybody believes that something should be censored to one point or another, to some degree or another. Obviously, any fascist state would not allow the propagation of communist ideals, and any communist society would not allow the propagation of Nazi ideals. So I just want to stay away from that very utopian vision where anybody can say anything all the time, and anything you put on film is therefore automatically free speech. You know, something to the variety that, say, maybe Vosh has videos of. Just saying. But we should be very careful in what it is that we censor, especially when we cannot trust the alternative. I'm sure basically everybody watching this would be okay with Nazis being banned from saying anything ever again, because the alternative is okay. But what if we have a situation like we do in in Ukraine right now, where we can't depend on either side to really tell us the whole truth, if even any of the truth? Then, in a sea of misinformation, you'll want to be careful that you don't bury or eliminate real information. And I think that's what we need in this situation. There is no very clear right or wrong. There is no science versus anti-vaxxers, where anti-vaxxers very clearly are wrong. And pseudoscience nonsense, flat earth, many conspiracy theories, etc. Now, you know me, I'm not pro-Russia or pro-Ukraine on this. My position has always been very firmly, I am pro-Donbass, I am pro-Lugansk, I am pro sections of Ukraine that voted to leave, freely and fairly voted to leave Ukraine. And I am anti-Nazi forces inside the country. And I do recognize that Zelensky is, for all intents and purposes, a U.S. puppet. I just wanted to clarify those, because really, when you're not taking a side in this conflict with Russia or Ukraine, you get attacked by both sides as having supported the other when you clearly don't. Now, it's fair to say that RT has been fairly good. A lot of the information that we never got in the West, or the NATO countries, etc., let's say the West, RT brought it to our attention. And we got information that we had never gotten before. We had gotten anti-imperialist viewpoints that we had never gotten before. Now, those anti-imperialist voices were not so critical of Russian imperialism. But nonetheless, we were getting information about U.S. imperialism that we were not getting before. And that was very important. RT was one of the things that first opened my eyes to things that I had never known. Histories that took place that I was unaware had happened. And I'm sure that's probably the same for many of you watching this right now. And it's a shame that we lost that. It's a shame that we lost someone like Lee Camp, redacted tonight. If my memory serves me correctly, he is RT America, and I believe his show is actually gone now, redacted tonight. And that's a shame. Now, while I wouldn't agree with him on very few issues, I would say I'm probably in line with him most of the time. But he was a very good source for things. His show was a good source for things that were going on in America that the mainstream media would not cover. Maybe many of you remember a long time ago the Alona show. They stopped her show in 2012 or 2013, I believe. It was along the same kind of lines, but it wasn't a comedy show like Redacted Tonight is. So there have been some really good programs on RT, stuff that we really needed to hear, that we weren't hearing from the mainstream media. But the problem is, there is a bit of a trap that people can fall into, and I've seen people fall into it before. Just because a news source or an intellectual is giving you a perspective that you've never heard before, that really jives with the way you feel about things and wrongs that have been committed, it does not mean that that alternative source or that alternative person is infallible and that everything they say is therefore automatically right. And there are people that will tend to follow that person or follow that news network uncritically and begin to believe just about everything it says because it has confirmed a lot of things that they have suspected about the other side. How many people discovered Noam Chomsky and learned a great amount of information about things that happened in the U.S. past, crimes, etc., saw his great debate about the Vietnam War from way back? But then you start to realize some other things that just wasn't making sense, or was just not in line with his positions. Like, in other words, you find out that for many people, your hero is not perfect. You know the old saying, never meet your hero. I used to be a very, very big fan of Noam Chomsky. And one day I heard him say dialectics doesn't make sense. And I heard him say he can't understand dialectics. It just doesn't make any sense. But that's nonsense. It does. And I have a very hard time believing that Chomsky doesn't understand dialectics. I mean, this is Chomsky we're talking about. I mean, you know, he is an intellectual, and a respected intellectual at that. And I don't believe that he just doesn't know. He's got to know. I suspect that he's lying. Because he, like many people, does have to be careful about what he says. And he wholeheartedly admits he has a lot of privilege. He's white, he's wealthy, and he can get away with a lot. But he can't get away with everything, which is true. And many of us have witnessed, those of us who've been around long enough, who've been in the communist community long enough, have seen his decline from being one of the most radical of radical to someone who's almost pandering to NATO at this point. And, abandoning, for somebody who claims to be an anarchist, and then abandoning many of those anarchist principles to stand on the United States' side of imperialism. I'm no expert on anarchism, but I'm pretty sure it rejects all forms of imperialism. So what I'm trying to say is, anybody can tell you what you really want to hear. And anybody can tell you what you really need to hear. But it doesn't mean that they're always right. I mean, I'm sure all of you, my audience watching this right now, would agree with RT when they criticize U.S. imperialism. But for God's sakes, don't ever go to the RT website and read the comments section in their articles. Because that's going to be a load of anti-Semitism you probably can't even handle. In other words, don't fall for the idea that the West is always wrong in whatever it does. Because sometimes the West could be right. I'm struggling to think of a moment when it was right, but you know what I mean. RT is not right all the time, and it does have its biases, and sometimes it does leave important information out because it's advantageous to Russian interests. With the removal of RT America, I am disappointed to see it go. In terms of getting news stories to you that I otherwise would not have heard from the mainstream media, RT has been very important that way. So I consider it a loss, not just for me, but for the public in general, because there was still very good information to get from it. And I was rather surprised by RT's coverage of the Ukrainian-Russian war. They were actually really kind of non-biased. Much of RT's coverage was feel sorry for the people of Ukraine, but leave out stuff here and there. It really tried to remain sympathetic to Ukraine and the military campaign is going through right now without necessarily waving the Russian flag at it. It was in a very weird position, one that I've never really seen from a large media outlet before. But nonetheless, they are gone. Now, many of us can still access RT.com. Many of us can still access RT organizations, and many of them being listed as Russian state-affiliated media, etc. But to finally end this video, we can lament the loss of RT as an alternative news source, but we cannot forget that it was fallible and that it did sometimes outright lie in favor of the Russian government and Russian capital imperialist interests. But that's always the point. Get your information. Get a great diversity of information. Put that information together and figure out for yourself what it means and where it leads to. Because we know that neither RT nor NATO should be trusted to tell you what to think. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.